Welcome to our mini lesson here on the introduction to the era of good feelings, something we'll look at more in our next episode as well. Alright, you see, what we have at the conclusion of the War of 1812 is basically the Federalist Party is all but destroyed. And so in the election of 1816, James Monroe, the Democratic Republican candidate, easily defeats what amounts to be the last Federalist candidate for president. And with that, one party came to dominate the era, the Democrat-Republican. And so this lack of partisan political strife kind of created this myth of national harmony and unity. In reality, there is growing discord and some troubles that we'll kind of look at as we move through these next couple episodes. However, with James Monroe ushered in as president, what you see is that these Republicans end up taking some of the Federalist ideas. Some of the things that they started to champion were internal improvements, which we'll take a look at the American system in our next episode. They also started championing the Second Bank of the United States and rechartering that. And then they also supported protective tariffs to help our manufacturing. Like I said, all kind of beliefs once held by the Federalists. Another issue that will pop up that we'll investigate as well, we'll deal with the issue of slavery as we see it starting to spread further and further westward. One of Monroe's influential appointments turns out to be John Quincy Adams, son of the former president John Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams gets appointed as Secretary of State, and he'll become president himself in 1824. Now, John Quincy Adams was a strong believer in expansionism. In fact, he's set his eyes upon the West and moving, our boundaries westward. But his first goal that he kind of looked at was Florida. Now, as he looked to expand American boundaries, he really would use any, means necessary, whether it's diplomacy, maybe the threat of military action, or just kind of allowing American citizens to kind of migrate westward on their own. It would kind of eventually maybe spread our boundaries any way possible. One of the first treaties signed between the British and the Americans was the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. Now, basically, this is kind of left over from the War of 1812, where both forces, feared invasions and left large fleets in the Great Lakes. Well, with this agreement, they both agreed to limit their naval fleets in the Great Lakes region and just limit to several small patrols, and also agreed never to invade each other. To further mark the beginnings of Anglo-American cooperation, in 1818, the British and Americans met at the Anglo-American Convention and came up with the agreement to establish the 49th parallel up to the Rocky Mountains as the boundary between British Canada and the United States. In this agreement, they also agreed to have a 10-year joint occupation of the Oregon country, which with the possibility of renewing it. But it kind of postpones, who can settle where in the Oregon country until a later date and time. However, you see, not only did we use diplomacy to settle some agreements, but we also used the threat of war, because John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, and other expansionists looked to the Spanish lands, and especially Florida, as the first area to kind of expand to. Now, what precipitated this expansion was that Andrew Jackson, yes, the famous New Orleans hero in the Battle of 1812, was chasing Seminoles into Florida and even took over several Spanish forts in 1818. Now, where many people wanted to condemn Jackson for his invasion into Spanish-held Florida, John Quincy Adams did not. He kind of used the Seminole uprising as an excuse to kind of negotiate with the Spanish, kind of arguing the fact that if the Spanish couldn't control the natives in their own territories, meaning Florida, then the Americans were justified to go down there and protect themselves. As General Jackson saw it, both the natives and runaway slaves were a threat, and that's why he invaded down into there. And being the fact that Spain had other concerns in Europe at the time, the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 does get signed, granting Florida to the United States. Another thing that the treaty does is establish a western boundary, symbolized by the red line on the map, between the Spanish lands and the United States. And then finally, it also agreed that the United States would assume liability for $5 million in damage done by American citizens who had rebelled against Spain. And as you are aware, besides using diplomatic means and threats of military to move west, sometimes citizens simply migrated westward themselves looking for business opportunities. One of those people is John Jacob Astor, who established the fort at Astoria in the Oregon Territory for the hopes of establishing himself in the lucrative fur trading business. And eventually the number of mountain men and fur traders grows, and you have legendary characters like Jebediah Smith and Kit Carson roaming the hills looking for furs. And as you can see here, by the time Monroe's presidency is nearly up in 1824, what North America basically looked like. Now, much of the Louisiana Territory was kind of nicknamed the Great American Desert, as most people believed it was just kind of thick, grassy prairie land that really wasn't good for anything. And most time people were just crossing it as there was natives living there and whatnot, and just simply looked to bypass it all the way out to the west coast to the Oregon and California territories. But the question did still remain as to what to do with the natives. Whether remove them, let them be, or whatnot. These are further issues that we'll discuss in future lessons. And finally, the era of good feeling kind of comes to a close at the end of Monroe's presidency in 1824 because we start seeing kind of a split in political thinking. And eventually we see the return of the two-party system. But we'll take a look at that in future chapters. And in our next episode, we'll continue to explore this era of good feeling.